Hello, folks. Welcome back to Management 5804, Leadership in Technology-Based Organizations. I'm Dr. David Townsend, and this will be lecture 9.2. And in this, we'll build on our first lecture on the whole product solution and value networks to now talk in more detail about what specific value propositions actually are, and particularly for mainstream customers. And so, again, we want to take something that is a kind of an ambiguous concept that's often thrown around in product design, new product development, and strategy literatures, and things that practitioners often talk about, practicing managers often talk about, and actually put some specific particulars around it, right? So what does it even mean to construct a value proposition? And what specific elements or things are there that can be wrapped into it? So what are the different ways to really create value for customers? And again, we've talked about why it's so important, but this is really going to be the centerpiece for us as we start to think about business model design moving into our next unit here in a few weeks. And so within that, right, this question of what a value proposition is important because as we've talked about across the technology adoption lifecycle, there's just different sources and types of values that the customers have, and there's not always a common consistency across these different segments. And in particular, we've talked about the differences between early and mainstream markets and the critical differences between enthusiasm and pragmatism and how it shapes customer buying behavior. And so it's crucial to understand the particulars of constructing a value proposition and how the elements will change as we move because it's difficult oftentimes to pin down. And we talk about the challenges of using psychographic profiling, right, to look at the underlying psychological motivations that customers have across these segments. And then, the real critical issue is that, as we talk about pragmatism, well, it also depends on what kind of market we're talking about because, certain types of products or services we buy in certain types of markets, pragmatism doesn't necessarily mean the same thing. I mean, we think about a computer. What does a pragmatic customer want with a computer? Well, you want it to work. You want it to be inexpensive. You want it to have certain features and functions built into it. And clearly that's very different than thinking about what a pragmatic customer who might be purchasing a car might want or might be purchasing a vacation experience on a cruise line, right? I mean, there's just an enormous amount of difference in the way that we can construct a value proposition. And so the technology adoption lifecycle gives us these general patterns that we have to use. But in order to do it effectively, we have to put a layer of specificity around our design strategies. And so this is crucial for us because we've got to figure out how to position a new innovation to ensure product market fit across these different segments. And so this notion of fit is going to be a bit crucial to some of our discussion in this particular lecture because now we've got to think about how, almost like an interlocking puzzle piece, customer needs are going to intersect with a specific design set of features within a product itself. And so fit broadly is going to be this crucial alignment between the psychographic drivers of customers within particular segments, the product and the product and feature values combined with that value network, right? So we've got to have all these interlocking elements together and produce that virtuous cycle that we talked about. So product market fit is, again, this idea that's discussed broadly, value propositions discussed broadly, but oftentimes not defined precisely enough for us to even understand what it is. And so within that, right, a value proposition, as the reading highlights, has four particular elements of value, right? So we start with this sort of functional value. And again, this is where a lot of the mainstream pragmatism comes from, is making sure the specifics of that product delivers some type of practical value to the end consumers. And so mainstream products are going to draw heavily from critical sources of functional value. And so it's going to be a little counterintuitive for us when we start to think about how to design a value proposition, because oftentimes we kind of start with specific elements that are higher on the pyramid and we move to make sure we incorporate some of the lower level values as we go forward. The second piece, again, is it talks about emotional connections, and so our emotional elements of value. And so emotions can be a critical source of a value proposition. Third, we've got life-changing, right? So something, a product or service experience or consumption setting that delivers some kind of perceived life-changing outcome for our consumer or our customer. And then lastly, social impact or symbolic reasons, right, where we can functionally again, deliver some, person can engage in some kind of consumption behavior that would drive social impact. And so again, as you read through it, and you think about these, right? These elements of value are going to work best if we can use it to create a disciplined approach to moving from early markets to mainstream markets. And so as we kind of think about how to accomplish the job to be done, right, these give us particular or specific triggers that we can use to construct a whole product solution, right? And so we can start to, again, piece these elements together to identify the critical elements that we need to be able to accomplish that job to be done. Now, what's also important about the elements of value framework is that it also shows us where pricing variability can come from in product design. And so as you move up the pyramid, pricing becomes increasingly more flexible or important because, again, the notion is for these higher order features or experiences that we create from products or services, typically, in many cases, that's going to yield a higher level of pricing. But at the same time, it's going to be much more expensive for us oftentimes to deliver those types of experiences. And so that becomes crucially important for us to consider. And then within that, the specific changes that happen as we move across that technology adoption lifecycle. And the critical thing, again, is we want to ensure alignment between sources of value and the target customer. And so within that, product market fit, right, is this connection between underserved needs and the critical value proposition. So the value proposition itself is going to be those key elements that drive people's purchasing decision for the product or service. And so again, the exact configuration is going to differ across industries, but it's based on the perception of value that customers have. So how much are we meeting what customers expect, right? So that second layer of a whole product or moving up to a whole product solution is making sure that we meet the minimum needs or the critical expected needs that customers have. And within that, right, there's key changes, digital firms, so companies that are building digital products and services, oftentimes have very different value propositions than brick and mortar companies, which can tap into to different frameworks. And so the reading, again, highlights these critical differences, but critically, or the critical difference, but importantly, again, product market fit is that connection between these two elements. And again, from the value pyramid standpoint, it kind of represents Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so we move from kind of baseline conditions to social impact. But critically, within that, we know that oftentimes we kind of start at the top of the pyramid and then we move down in some ways to make sure that we at least attach to some functional needs and wants that pragmatic customers are going to have. And then as we move into the conservative side, things like reducing risk can be crucially important to make sure we tap into kind of late maturity customers. And so across this pyramid here, right, these elements, as we combine them together, right, these are the things that drive customer loyalty. But what's important, again, to attach these ideas together is that we can't oftentimes do all these things ourselves just through a product. We need a value network to be able to deliver these elements of value. And again, we may focus on particular aspects of it when we're building a product or service, but we may need to rely on other customers, or other complementary services or other companies to help us to deliver. And again, we're going to start potentially in early markets by focusing on social impact, life-changing, those type of things. So self-transcendent may drive some of the innovator part of the market. Life-changing, critical things that we can attach into with our early adopter community. And then as we kind of cross the chasm, it's life-changing, emotional, starting to drive into functional, and we can link these things together. And so if you think about a Tesla, early on, like the Tesla Roadster, it attaches into, it may be a little bit much to call it self-transcendence, but it was certainly tapping into those elements where you have this, somewhat of a brand new, compelling sports car. Not many of them, and but it provides some means to have social impact by reducing carbon emissions. And so the markets that Tesla went after early on, certainly you could be defined maybe as self-transcendent, but self-actualization, right? So you've kind of reached the peak. And then the Model S tapped into some of those elements as kind of a early adopter car, and and then created sort of this exclusive network. So tapped a little bit into that affiliation and belonging. And then, the emotional pieces, there's a little bit of that with the Model X, where you can kind of see the fun entertainment, attractiveness, the access piece, certainly as they start to build out the value network with the charging stations, you start to see some elements where they're moving into, starting to get closer to functional. But the Model S itself, you can see it still has some of these higher order features to it, and certainly has this, affiliation, belonging, maybe a little bit of self-actualization because there's kind of symbolic value in what's being created. So you're driving the Model S around, people still kind of pay attention to it. It's got a little bit of the fun entertainment because it's still a really fast car, goes much faster than most mid-sized sedans that you would buy, certainly faster than a Toyota Camry or Honda Accord or other types of cars. But now it starts to get into, some of these save time, reduces risk, organize. And so you saw this a little bit with the some of the Model 3 pitches here, where they just did some more Consumer Reports testing, and and they're talking about how safe these cars are. So you see Musk continuing to highlight some of the functional value that the Model 3 is going to be able to deliver. Certainly has some sensory appeal, and certainly has other elements that are baked into it, but reducing the cost and driving the specific elements of value towards pragmatic customers. You can see changes in how the cars themselves are designed, and even how the company itself has built a value network as they move from early market to the higher end of the pyramid to lower parts of that market, which again are going to be more appealing to a broader set of customers. So that's why we move from self-transcendence or self-actualization or motivation to, through some emotional avenues towards the practical things that mainstream customers are looking for. And now, critically, as the reading highlights, and we've talked about, these elements are going to change. And so it really depends on the industry. And so there's not one recipe that we can attach into that's going to be most important for everything. And so part of it is just identifying, what are the critical sets of features that customers want. And just because, we move further down the pyramid as we go more mainstream, doesn't mean we can't add some of those higher order features into it. And so these insights come from the engagement that we have as we listen to the different underlying psychographic drivers of buying decisions with our customers as we go from early to mainstream markets. And so we know within that there's different ways that reading highlights some of the particulars here, but figuring out how to build these webs of features for products to outcompete competitors, right? So we're taking a disruptive product and we're adding things to it to try to build that whole product solution to make sure we achieve product market fit. The crucial part of it is understanding how those elements are linked together effectively. And we'll talk about the cost side of it when we get into the business model discussions in the next unit. But the crucial thing overall here is making sure that there's a rigorous matching between the choices that we're making with what our customers are looking for. And so, apparel, obviously it's not, retail apparel is not necessarily looking for self-actualization. There's a lot of pragmatic elements that are driving that. But if we think about brokerage, right, some higher order categories there, and then we can sort of think about, purchasing a home or purchasing an educational experience or other things, right? You've got elements that can potentially encompass, broader ranges of that value pyramid depending on the type of industry that it's in. And so the specific configuration, again, is making sure that the specific needs that customers have of what drives them to buy. And so we call them pragmatism, but what does that look like in particular industries? What does it mean for customers to be pragmatic? And so these elements, again, help us define and put more precision around the particulars of product design to move from that generic product into developing truly that whole product solution that even anticipates aspects of what customers are looking for that they may not even be aware of. But we understand because, again, that's our job to do, is to make sure that the product or service delivers that full slate of value to overwhelm that customer with value in order to drive adoption within the mainstream.